Good morning. I hope you're doing well this week. We actually are getting some nicer weather for a change here in Nebraska. I don't know where you're at and what you got going on, but it's been really nice, like jacket weather instead of below zero temps. So that's been nice. Well, we are continuing on with our reading from Dr. Atkins Diet Revolution by Robert C. Atkins, MD. And before I go any further, just a little disclaimer. I'm not a medical professional, so go to your own doctor before trying anything that I talk about in my videos. I don't want to be, uh, I don't want that you be doing something that's not right for you and your body, and I want you to be safe and healthy in the best way for you. So this chapter today is called What Causes This 20th Century Plague? We tend to take it for granted that the way we eat now is the way we always ate. Nothing could be further from the truth. For most of man's 50 million years on Earth, we have lived off the flesh and fat of other animals. When times were hard, the women would gather roots and berries. This might have amounted to 15 grams of carbohydrate a day, perhaps half an ounce, but man was a hunter and our eating habits were largely carnivorous. It is important to remember that the body you live in now is a 50 million year old body that evolved on this diet. No orange juice for breakfast, yet the body not only survived, it flourished. Weaklings who couldn't maintain health, stamina, and agility on this virtually no carbohydrate diet were quickly bred out of existence. How man's diet came to have a profoundly damaging effect on his health. Step 1. Around 7000 BC, a few minutes ago, anthropologically speaking, Neolithic man began to plant grains and roots and settle down. His diet began to contain a higher percent of unrefined carbohydrates. For those who couldn't adjust to this, the mortality rate was undoubtedly high. Next came the food processing revolution. The second step was much more recent, about 200 years ago, and grew out of man's ambition to store grain so that he would have it on hand between growing seasons. This was, and still is, achieved by making grain products so nutritionally sterile that even pests and other microorganisms couldn't live on them. Rice was polished, flours were degerminated and bleached. The result was a loss of most B vitamins and other essential nutrients, and an increased consumption of refined carbohydrates. Then came refined sugar, the killer carbohydrate. Sugar has been important in our diet for less than 100 years. The Crusaders introduced it to Europe, but for centuries only apothecaries had it to sell, and they sold it by the ounce. Only the richest could afford it, and then it was reserved for state occasions. But by 1750, it is estimated that the average Englishman ate 4 pounds a year, and by 1840, it still was only about 20 pounds. It is difficult to calculate just how much sugar we consume in the United States today. What we use right from the bowl on fruit and cereal, in tea, coffee, and cooking is a small part of the total. 3 doctors doing research at the State University of Iowa, Muhammad A. Antar, Margaret A. Olson, and Robert E. Hodges, estimate that we take in as much as 110 pounds of sugar and syrup per person a year, in everything from soups and salad dressings to soft drinks, desserts, and candies. We also eat another 60 pounds of simple carbohydrates in honey, fruit, and milk, bringing our consumption of various kinds of sugar to a grand total of 170 pounds a year. That's a lot of sugar. And in the year following the unfortunate and, I feel, unjustifiable ban on cyclamates, the per capita consumption of sugar escalated another 5 pounds. And he'll get into the cyclates in a little bit here. The highest dietary change in 50 million years, from 4 pounds of sugar, the most concentrated of carbohydrates, to 175 pounds per person a year in 11 generations. This may well be the most drastic dietary change in man's environment in its whole 50 million years of existence. Isn't that just crazy? I mean, if we would just reduce our sugars, just that one thing alone would do so much for our health. So if there's nothing else you take out of this, reduce your sugar, and I guarantee you're going to have a big change in your body. So what? Sugar makes us fat. It makes dentists rich. One doctor asked, if simple sugar can rot and crumble away to nothing, the hardness of teeth, what ruin is it wreaking on the rest of the body? But what is the evidence as to other damage caused by sugar? Let's take the least first. Sugar causes a vitamin B deficit. In order to assimilate carbohydrates, large quantities of vitamin B are required. Sugar, of course, contains no vitamins or nutrients of any kind, except sucrose. So the body is forced to draw on its own vitamin B reserves. The more sugar you take in, the greater the vitamin B deficit imposed on your body. It is important, then, to understand that sugar has an anti-nutrient property. This is true to a lesser extent of all carbohydrates that you take in. Starch is a major cause of hidden sugar because the body turns starch into sugar while it is in the stomach. In order to know the truth about your sugar intake, you must visualize all starchy food as servings of sugar. Sugar causes basic metabolic disturbances. Since it was only 4 or 5 generations ago that we began eating a diet moderately high in sugar, there hasn't been enough time for natural selection to evolve a human genetic system able to deal satisfactorily with today's tidal wave of refined sugar and starch. Given this deluge of sugar and refined carbohydrates, the pancreas is forced to behave hysterically. It overreacts to the repeated signal for insulin release that carbohydrates cause and floods the bloodstream with this blood sugar lowering hormone until the blood level of sugar is lower than when the signal was first received. That's hypoglycemia. After this has gone on long enough in the genetically predisposed individual, the insulin becomes less and less effective until eventually diabetes is the result, as we have seen. Because it takes all kinds of bodies to make a species, we all know some lucky people who can eat anything and not gain. They happen to have bodies that can deal with carbohydrates, but they are in the minority. Now let's look at your individual situation. Let's consider what's in your family history and life pattern may be causing or contributing to the possibility that you are carbohydrate sensitive. Well, I'll tell you what, my mom had diabetes. 2 of her sisters had it. Well, one still does. And I'm pretty sure that her parents had it. I'm pretty sure that it's kind of a long line of family members that have had it. So I'm very high risk for it. I do get tested, and I got tested again this past year, and I don't have it right now. So that's another reason for me to be doing this diet, is to make sure that I get ahead of that. Being carbohydrate intolerant is largely a matter of genes. Mark Twain wrote, "When you're born, you're finished." A joke? My records show that 48 out of 50 patients who have come to me for overweight have relatives who are either diabetic or overweight, two of the surest signs of carbohydrate disturbance. And yes, my mother was overweight. Most fat babies have fat parents. A survey of several thousand overweight children in the Boston area showed that only 10% had parents of normal weight. Similar surveys in Chicago, Philadelphia, Edinburgh, and Vienna showed the same results. This doesn't mean that you're finished if you have diabetes or overweight in your family background. There is something you can do about it. This diet will fight both. Mother love is not the villain of the story. You will hear it said that the reason for this is because the mother constantly forces food on the child. I don't believe this. I think mothers, particularly those who are themselves overweight, are very sensitive to the suffering and heartache that overweight causes. It is my belief that as a rule, they do not overfeed their children. Quite another factor is involved. These children are born hungrier. The metabolic defect they suffer from is apparent from the crib as increased hunger. Children like this show they are not satisfied by the quantity of formula presented to them. Even after a feeding, they may still cry and scream. Mothers today have been indoctrinated into the concept of demand feeding, so they relent and give their offspring a little more of the formula. They are not force feeding. They are barely satisfying the baby's very real hunger. Although overfeeding in infancy is not likely to take place, incorrect feeding may well be the cause of child onset obesity. After all, what is the first extra nutrient added into our culture when the basic milk formula is expanded upon? You guessed it, sugar. Sweetened orange juice, strained bananas, applesauce, and sweetened cereals are all added early on in an infant's feeding program. And when he is not much older, cookies and candy become his principal reward. By the time he is old enough to think for himself, his carbohydrate susceptible body is already ravaged by his well meaning parents with the support of the nutritional authorities. A study should be done to demonstrate what the strict avoidance of refined carbohydrate from infancy on can do to prevent childhood onset obesity. I am confident the results would be startlingly successful. Yeah, that is so true. You go into the baby section of your grocery store or Walmart or whatever, and you see all these cookies and candies for snacks for these 1 and 2 year olds or younger. And they tell you, oh, they were telling me when my kids were babies that you should start with vegetables, because if you start with fruits, then they won't like the vegetables. And, that makes sense. We need the vegetables first. And another thing is that, the cereals themselves, those are carbs and those have high sugar contents in them. They sweeten them up to make them taste good and so that the kids will eat them. And then guess what? We just trained our kids that sugar is what they want. So, and you can't really find anything else in the baby section. So, unless you make your own, that's kind of what you're stuck with. A resistance to losing can also be inborn. Our 50-million-year-old body naturally contains a few odd bits and pieces for which it has no further use. These leftovers from primeval lifestyles can be troublesome. The appendix is one example. Another recently discovered by Dr. Jerome Niddle and Dr. Jules Hirsch, both of Rockefeller Institute, is an overgrowth of fat cells. This overgrowth of fat cells is nestled in the tissues between the skin and the muscles, especially on the abdomen. Back in our primeval days, when long periods might elapse between meals, those fat cells were a survival mechanism. Today, they're the opposite. It's absolutely vital to eat our way around this hazard. I've heard for a long time about how in the caveman days, they didn't have food for maybe weeks. I don't know. And I've heard so many times about how that's how our ancestors back then survived, was like you just said, because they didn't have access to all the food like we have today in our grocery stores. And this pandemic time should be a realization of how lucky we are to be able to just walk into a grocery store and get whatever we want. Because there's been, a couple of times now that the toilet paper has been flying off the shelves and other items too. And it's been hard to get things at times. So I think we should count ourselves lucky that we have these grocery stores that we can just walk into and get what we need. Is an overgrowth of fat cells hereditary? Even thin people have some of these cells, tiny storehouses of fat and potential energy. But fat people have an overgrowth of them, often from babyhood. In the first few months of life, they can triple or quadruple in number, Niddle and Hirsch discovered. And once these fat cells appear, they remain for life. At an age up to adolescence, this growth of fat cells can appear. Then the prognosis for ultimate control of the child's weight problem into adulthood is poor. Dr. Niddle feels that it is nearly hopeless. However, in my own practice, I have treated hundreds of such cases of childhood overweight, and by living on the diet in this book, they have managed to control their weight. See Perry Zenley's story in Chapter 1. The reason for the poor outlook in these cases is a metabolic effect of fat cells themselves. Fatty tissues is not the inherent accumulation of blubber that it seems to be, but rather an active organ of metabolism. Among other functions, the membranes of the fat cells, by arresting the action of insulin, cause an increased production of this hormone. So even if starvation should reduce the cell size, the more fat cells, the more cell membranes, and therefore greater the production of insulin. Age in itself can make you allergic to carbohydrates, which means fat. Even if you didn't have overweight parents, even if you didn't begin life as a plump baby, chock-a-block with fat cells, there is no guarantee that you won't be overweight and oversensitized to sugar by the time you've been eating and drinking for 60 years or so in the carbohydrate culture. There are exceptions, but in general, the ability to our bodies to handle carbohydrates lessens as we grow older, and so we get fatter. Stress and anxiety can make you allergic to carbohydrates, which means fat. Stress, anxiety, and emotional tension tend to make carbohydrate-sensitive people fat. Here's why. When we are under strain, our bodies put out adrenaline, and adrenaline raises blood sugar levels. This in turn triggers off a flood of insulin so that the blood sugar ends up lower than it started. It is important to note that insulin's lowering effect on the blood sugar is more potent and longer lasting than is adrenaline's opposite effect. It is at this low point that we eat and drink for energy, for comfort, to rest and calm our fears, anger, and tensions. And these high carbohydrate pick me up feedings lay on the pounds. Being anxious causes low blood sugar, and low blood sugar causes feelings of anxiety most of us satisfy with high carbohydrate food and drink. Happily, there is a way to break this vicious cycle, the diet in this book. It allows for protein and fat pick-me-ups as often as you like. You see, protein-fat combinations tend to be insulin stabilizers, biologically speaking. That is, they, unlike carbohydrates, do not dramatically affect blood sugar levels and thus do not trigger the insulin flood. On this diet, your blood sugar is gradually brought into the normal range where it stays because nothing is eaten, which triggers off an insulin deluge. I can't say that word. And in this tranquilizing metabolic climate, stress and anxiety can fade away. I'm going to drink real quick. That makes total sense to me. I've had a lot of anxiety in my life as well, and I've had, I believe, sugar addiction big time. So that is interesting. Jenny O'Hara came to me at an anxious time. Jenny O'Hara was just beginning her turn as star of the Broadway hit Promises, Promises when she came to see me in August 1971. She is 5 feet 6 inches tall and she weighed 142.25 pounds. That is too much for a civilian. That is too much for a civilian, and it's far too much for an actress, she says. But I dreaded the thought of going on a diet just at this hectic time. I thought it will make me nervous and irritable and tense and tired and miserable the way diets always do. How will I ever stand it? And then it wasn't so at all. I feel fantastic. I never had so much energy in my life. Yet before I started on this diet, I used to sleep hours in the day. I was so tired. So then I'd go on that horrible sweet cycle, eat sweets for a lift, then find my energy had dropped way below where it was when I ate the sweets. Jenny's parents are very much overweight, and she was a fat child, a fat teenager. Her top weight was 160 when she was 17, and she hovered between 145 and 150 most of the time. I'm a pastry maven, Jenny admits. Now she hovers between 120 and 125, which is just where she wants it. And the inches have come off like crazy, she says. She had tried and failed with many diets. I'm a pastry buff, she confesses. I have a craving for sweets of all kinds. That was what would always ruin me. It's such a strange and wonderful thing that on this diet I'm not hungry for all those things I'm not supposed to eat. What does it, I think, is being able to have butter and sour cream and mayonnaise. I love grilled chopped steak mixed with a little garlic and topped with sour cream and pepper. And steak with a square of sweet butter sitting on it. I love quiche Lorraine, which is perfectly legal. One just leaves the crust. I've got a lot of enjoyment out of the cheesecake, and I invented a pumpkin souffle made with heavy cream and sweeteners and spices that's just great. Between meals, Jenny munches on macadamia nuts and cheese. Cheddar is her favorite. For lunch, she loves all beef hot dogs, and for breakfast, with her eggs, Jones sausage, one of the brands without filler. Just being a woman makes you especially susceptible to carbohydrate allergy. Even women who are not usually hypoglycemic frequently develop periodic low blood sugar in the week before menstruation. I can believe that. The state of affairs can account for those feelings of depression, irritability, and emotional instability that trouble so many women. That all gone feeling also leads to the feeling of comfort foods such as cookies, candy, cake. All the weight that women gain before their periods isn't merely water weight. With many women, each period is followed by a week of crash dieting. Women also are peculiarly vulnerable to a common disorder of the body fluid retention called idiopathic edema of women. This, too, is a known disturbance of carbohydrate metabolism. Often, too, hypoglycemia and overweight begin with a woman's first pregnancy and increase with each pregnancy thereafter. Pregnancy and childbirth add enormously to the stresses and anxieties under which a woman lives, and they act as triggers that can initiate a permanent metabolic disturbance. Also, during pregnancy, a woman's body is flooded with female hormones, which sets off an excess secretion of insulin. Modern obstetricians are aware that hypoglycemia lingering on can be the cause of post-childbirth depression as well. Yeah, I totally get that. There was a while there that I had such severe depression every month. Um, I started taking vitamin B complex. I took it all the time, not just during that time, and it really helped me. And that right there is evidence because what he was just saying a little bit ago about how sugar takes the vitamins out of your body. I mean, then that's why I need to supplement with vitamin B. So that makes total sense to me. I don't know about you. Let me know, give me a comment and let me know what your thoughts are on it. Caffeine also aggravates carbohydrate intolerance. The caffeine in our coffee and even the uh, theobrine, I don't know, in our tea can lead to excess insulin production. Our national consumption of soft drinks, many of which contain uh, significant amounts of caffeine as well as sugar, has contributed importantly to our national vulnerability to overweight, hypoglycemia, heart disease, and diabetes. But if I had to pick the single causative factor most responsible for the obesity epidemic that has spread through all westernized countries, it would be the overconsumption of refined sugar. I think something should be done to correct the situation now. Candy bars and soft drinks should carry a warning statement equivalent to the one on cigarette packages, stating that cigarette smoking is dangerous to your health. Packages of sugar-containing products might read, "Warning, this product contains sugar and may physically injurious to some individuals. Consult your physician before purchase and use." Wouldn't that be nice? Other aggravators, the pill and estrogen replacement therapy. The pill for birth control and the estrogen used as menopausal hormone replacement therapy have the same kind of effect as pregnancy. They increase the severity of hyperinsulinism and therefore aggravate hypoglycemia, diabetes, and overweight. If you are on these medications, you would not be expected to do well with this or any other diet. In other words, you may be forced to choose between the female hormone and being slim and having normal blood sugar levels. Men are really no luckier. Men are not by any means exempt from the havoc wreaked by refined sugar and starch. One Swedish study showed that in men, carbohydrate intolerance went up steadily every decade from the age of 20 on. In women, this change doesn't occur until the menopause is reached. This data correlates with the fact that men are susceptible to heart attacks from their 20s on, but that women, unless they are diabetic, are far less likely to get heart disease until after menopause. Does what you've just read seem like a flat contradiction? How could I tell you that the pill and estrogen replacement therapy aggravate hyperinsulinism and that it's train of connected disorders, and then in the next breath tell you that postmenopausal women who have lost most of their estrogen become as vulnerable as men to those same disorders? Sounds like a flat contradiction, doesn't it? It's not, though. It merely points up one of medicine's many remaining mysteries. We know that these seemingly contradictory states of affairs exist, so we can come to only one conclusion. Estrogen alone is not the protective agent. There are other hormones, other factors at work in natural hormonal balance of the premenopausal woman. We don't really know which element plays the protective role here. We only can assume from our observations that such a factor must exist. The more potent psychodrugs cause weight gains. In these take a pill for whatever ails you times, it is hardly a surprise that some of our drugs designed to help people have side effects that do just the opposite. A good example, the more potent psychodrugs. The major categories of such potent medicines are the phenazines, such as thorazine and compazine, and the psychic energizer groups, Elavil and Sinequin, for example. My own clinical observations, as yet unproven, suggest that both seem to increase insulin output and lead to weight gain and hypoglycemia. This may not be true of the milder drugs, such as Librium, Valium, and mepibomate. Now, because hypoglycemia is so often the root cause of psychoneurotic symptoms, such as depression and anxiety, it is hypoglycemics who are very likely to receive these drugs. You can see how such drugs, useful as they are, can, and if your problem is really hypoglycemia, provide more harm than benefit. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I have worked with hundreds of psychiatric patients, and I have found that this diet sometimes has been more effective than the drugs in stabilizing the mental symptoms my patients have been suffering. In many cases, working with the patient psychiatrist, we were able to reduce the dosage of these potent drugs and, in some cases, discontinue them completely. As patients began to show a sometimes miraculous and dramatic improvement in their depression, anxiety, and adjustment problems. And that's the end of that chapter. I will tell you that I am on Lexapro, and I know that's one of the side effects it lists is weight gain. And so that may be part of why I think 20 pounds in a year is awesome for me. But I could probably do better if I wasn't on it. But I can tell that I need it. And so I'm going to stay on it until I don't need it. But, that's something to kind of talk to your doctor about as well after you've been doing this diet for a while. Then maybe consider getting off of a medication that you've been on or reducing it, but only if your doctor says it's okay. So, don't go and do anything silly like just stop taking your medication. That's not a safe way to do it. Your body would go into shock and a lot of bad things could happen to you depending on what your medication is. And so with that in mind, go ahead and give me your thoughts in the comment section. And what other questions would you have that you'd like me to do a video about? Because I don't want to just be sitting here reading a book to you forever. To do another results video at the 1st of April to let you know how I've been doing this year. And so, let me know what questions you're having, struggles, whatever it is that you'd like to hear more about, and I will make a video. But at any rate, that's all for today, and I will see you next week. Join the journey.